pleasure to introduce to you the Spring 25 Burns Scholar, following in a long line of illustrious Burns scholars, which goes back over 40 years. I think there was a bit of a slip around the time of COVID, where the Burns fellow wasn't the best then, but apart from that, the others were good. Caoimhe. Was it? No, that one was good. That one was good. I was referring to somebody else then. All right, can you hear me now? Otherwise, I'll take this away and project really strong. All right, so Caoimhe Nic Dháibhéid comes from Cork in the south of Ireland. That's where she did her undergraduate degree at UCC, University College Cork. Then she crossed the whole length of Ireland all the way to the north and spent quite a few years in Belfast, where she got graduate degrees, MA and PhD at Queen's University Belfast. Remained in the university in the Institute of Irish Studies as a research fellow, and then crossed the Irish Sea to Cambridge. I think it was Fitzwilliam College, where she was a research fellow in the University of Cambridge, before taking up the position, going to the place, and then getting promotion to become Professor of Modern History at the University of Sheffield. In addition to that, Caoimhe also has a very interesting contemporary role, which we're waiting to see how that will unfold. She's the co-chair, together with Lord Bew, of an advisory committee on an official public history of the Northern Ireland Troubles, which was launched by the previous UK government and is now being renewed. I think exactly now is being renewed by the current government. I was wondering if there's anybody in Belfast is going to notice a pattern there, that both Lord Bew, who is a former Burns scholar, and Caoimhe is a Burns scholar, and will they question and ask for commentary on that, in which I can say quite clearly that I will say nothing. But moving on to kind of her scholarship. So Caoimhe is the author of two very substantial books within Irish history. The first was on Seán MacBride, famous revolutionary Seán MacBride. And she picks up his story, I believe, from 1904, which is a significant date in his biography, being born then, and goes all the way through to 1946, following his revolutionary life. And in opposition to the state, and as a senior member of the IRA also later, and stops, leaving somebody else to follow. Somebody needs to pick up the baton now and continue the next story of him in Clan Poblachta as a politician, working with the state, all the way through as an illustrious politician, all the different roles, all the way through to the Nobel Peace Prize, international. So that somebody's got to keep up the work there, because you set a very high bar for that one. Caoimhe has also written a book on biographies of international terrorists. Interesting topic, looking at their biographies, which gives you insight in different nations, in different countries. What are the motivations that sends people to engage in violent acts against modern states? And that's a remarkable book, and I believe that is part of a larger collaboration with St. Andrews, which is a major center for the history of terrorism in the British Isles and in Ireland. That's a remarkable publication. She's also co-edited a number of very important publications. I'm thinking of the volume that you co-edited. I believe that your co-editor happens to be by chance in the room here. The volume on constitutional and republican politics from Parnell to Paisley. So it's good that the co-editor could make it to this event, a reunion after 15 years or so. Yeah, we're happy about that with Colin Reid. And also, she co-edited together with Lord Bew and with Mary Coleman a volume not too long ago on the centenary perspectives on the formation of Northern Ireland, 1921. These are interesting moments. In addition to that, Caoimhe has published extensively, many articles and many chapters. Now, I assume that I'm probably one of the few people in this room, together with Colin, perhaps also Caoimhe, who's read all those articles. And so when I try to characterize them, I'd say maybe Jennifer as well. We'll be kind there. But we'll say Jennifer Regan Lefebvre from the university, from Trinity College in Connecticut. A lot of those articles, the main thrust of them would be dealing with the revolutionary period, the period of the Irish Revolution. And Caoimhe has had interesting insights on a period which many historians have engaged with. In fact, she even has an article where she looks at the role of historians in the decade of commemoration. Now, one might think that there's nothing more to say about the Irish Revolution. Having since there was announced a decade of commemorations, which continued for more than a decade, because an Irish decade is always more than the decade itself, right? It was 11 years, but it went on for a good while, and everybody in Irish history seemed to be writing and commenting on the Irish Revolution, but Caoimhe consistently has added other perspectives. Here I think specifically of my own memory in this one. I remember very distinctly in York, hearing you give a talk, Caoimhe. I believe it was 2012, am I correct? You gave a talk in York, which stays very strongly in my memory, about the orphans of the executed leaders of the Easter Rising. That was a startling talk. It was a remarkable talk. And for those who want to read it, I've seen that it came out in print a couple of years ago in the Journal of British Studies, which is about national orphans, or the orphans' nations and national trauma, or the other, I'm forgetting which was the national, which was the nation, but it's a remarkable engagement of what happens to the orphans afterwards. And I've also seen that you've written about their schooling as well, which is interesting. So that's well worth it. I strongly recommend that among the many different articles that Caoimhe has written. We're here because Caoimhe is still exposing in her recent research, new perspectives. Exactly when you think that the revolution is dusted and could be put aside for a decade, for a generation, is exposing new perspectives on the Irish Revolution, specifically regarding new historiographical developments and new sensibilities that we have, looking at history of emotions, looking at history of everyday life. And that's why we're also privileged, because as Christian mentioned, Caoimhe is also teaching a course here on the Irish Revolution. So we're privileged to see, I see quite a few of the students in the class, both undergraduate and graduates here attending tonight. It really is a privilege to have this master class with somebody at the level of Caoimhe Nic Dháibhéid teaching a course. And that's what the Burns program is about. It's our signature program to bring leading scholars in the field and to bring them not only to give public lectures and to do their own research, but to have them interact with our students in a very personal kind of way where people can actually see the work being worked out as it's work in progress. It's not even published yet, which is very, very exciting. So we're here to hear today about love in the time of revolution. And before I call you up, Caoimhe, to thank me for this very generous introduction, which is a cliche, which we don't do here in Irish Studies, so you can skip that bit. I'm going to point out something, if I may. You're too late on the scene. The title's already been taken. And that's the difficult thing here, which we should note. About 13 years ago or so, an American historian passed away now. Maybe Connery might have known him. Andrew Clayton. Did you know the name Andrew Clayton? Andrew Clayton wrote a book called Love in the Time of Revolution. The revolution he was referring to, because he referred to the writings of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. So the revolution was the French Revolution, and the aftermath of the American Revolution, the French Revolution. So that was already a book that kind of coined the term. A decade ago, there was a volume which was called New Dangerous Liaisons, edited by Louisa Passerini and a group of other prestigious historians. And inside there was a chapter by Marcy Shore, an historian in Yale, who also wrote a chapter called Love in the Time of Revolution. And she was referring to Polish revolutionaries meeting at a cafe, the famous cafe in Warsaw. And that's when they met, these kind of romantic revolutionaries in the 1920s interwar period. So that's another Love in the Time of Revolution. And then about 6 years ago, a documentary came out called Love in the Time of Revolution, set in Hong Kong. So it's activists meeting as they resist Chinese impositions. And that's just a few of the Love in Time of Revolutions. I'm not calling you out here to say that you're engaging in plagiarism, because we don't do that, we're not Harvard. But I'm saying that title has been taken, and so when you actually publish this work, you might have to rework the title. But we're particularly excited to hear about intimacy, affection, and kinship through letters and other forms of what's happening behind the scenes of these revolutionaries that we hear so much about. So please, Caoimhe, we're looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian, and your colleagues, and Caroline for hosting this event. Thank you to all of the team who were involved in preparing the room and providing such generous hospitality. Thank you to Guy for that really generous introduction. It's actually Gabriel Garcia Marquez, right, who originated the term love in the time of revolution, and all of us historians are just kind of taking it and applying it to our various revolutionary contexts. But thank you also to all of the team and all of the community over at Connolly House in Irish Studies. Everyone has been so welcoming, so kind, so encouraging, particularly Maria and Rachel, who have answered all of my endless questions about how things work, how does the printer work, how does this work, how does that work, but also the wider community from staff right through to the graduate students. It's been really nurturing to be here for this semester as I work through what is complex and challenging and very rich material. And so you're getting a sneak preview of some of my thoughts as I begin to work through this material and establish what this actually meant for our understanding of the Irish Revolution. I am from Cork. That is a mural in Cork City, which you might recognise. It's called The Lovebirds, the mural, and it's Terence McSweeney and his wife Muriel Murphy, who you might recognise. They're just two of the revolutionary couples that I'll talk about in this talk today. So, I will begin. When I think of writing to you, I keep thinking how I will address you, to impress on you how much I love you, and to tell you how you are in my thoughts every moment I am awake. 100 terms of endearment come to my mind that would perhaps look foolish and ridiculous when written, so I just write dearest, and know that you will realise all that I put into that word. So Agnes MacNeill, known as Taddy to her husband, wrote to her husband Owen MacNeill on the 1st of December 1916 as they approached their first Christmas apart. And that photograph is at the top, it's entitled At Liberty Again, and it's Owen and Agnes with their children on his release in 1917. Although, as we know, Owen MacNeill had tried to call off the Easter Rising, issuing the countermanding order on Easter Sunday, he had nonetheless been arrested and sentenced to penal servitude for life and was serving his sentence in a variety of English prisons. 4 years later, Kevin O'Higgins, then Assistant Minister for Local Government in the Underground Revolutionary Administration, wrote to his fiancée Bridget Cole that we'll make a cloak of our big love that will defy any old breeze or showers that chances along. She had made for him a strange, beautiful world with light and shade and colours which I never saw and never dreamed of. 3 years later, in the midst of the Civil War, Cathy Barry wrote to her fiancé Jim Maloney that her love for him made her feel all queer, kind of dazed and bewildered and doubtful and scared and awful happy. So these three vignettes, dotted through the revolutionary calendar from 1916, 1920 and 1923, reveal the subject of my talk this evening: the different forms of love that existed during the Irish Revolution and how intimate relationships were refracted through, disrupted by, and in some cases engulfed by the urgency of revolution. Of course, the regular rhythms of intimate and personal life continued, even as the political drumbeat quickened. Men and women met, married, formed friendships, had children in the midst of revolutionary upheavals. Children grew up with revolutionary parents and grappled with their absence in some cases, and as Guy mentioned, I've written about that at some length already. Love for Ireland was a given for revolutionaries during the years 1916 to 23, but how did this patriotic love commingle with romantic, marital, platonic, and familial love? And what can the various love stories I will share with you tell us about what it was actually like to live through the Irish Revolution? So I'm going to begin by setting out some of the context for effective histories of this sort in Ireland as the revolution dawned. So the social context for courtship, marriage, and establishing a family in Ireland has been carefully documented by historians such as Mary O'Dowd, Maria Luddy, Mary Daly, and Catriona Clear. They have pointed to significant structural and economic changes in the late 19th century in Ireland, including the expansion of the road and the railway system, improved education and employment opportunities for women, and a declining rural population due to immigration. All of these changes led to a much more expansive set of possibilities for a marriage partner than in the pre-famine period. And as Roy Foster and Senya Peseta have argued, the pre-revolutionary period opened up exciting new social and public spaces for young men and women to meet, socialise and fall in love. And I really like this photograph. It's of a Gaelic League feis in Listowel, and you see a female harpist just surrounded by a bevy of men below her. And the Gaelic League was genuinely exciting. It was an exciting place to be. It was, you could meet people and socialise in ways that had not been possible for previous generations. And some of the couples I talked about indeed met in spaces like this. Terence MacSweeney met Muriel Murphy at a musical soiree in Cork in 1915. Joseph Campbell met Nancy Maud, I'll talk about them a little bit later, at the Irish Literary Society, one of their meetings in London in 1909. And this trend just continued during and immediately after the revolution. Men and women met, cooperated and socialised in more liberated environments than ever. And I should be clear, this applies particularly and perhaps most of all to middle class or rising lower class couples. More likely, as the work of Peter Hart and Tom Garvin has shown, to be involved in revolutionary activity in the first place, and more likely to end up with the sort of stable households that allowed for the preservation of personal archives of the sort that I'll talk about today. And it's interesting to note that there was a glut of revolutionary marriages in 1917 and 1918. There's Muriel and Terence, that's the image from which the mural is taken in Cork at their wedding. Next we have Dermot Lynch and Mary Casey getting married in 1917. Here we have Kevin O'Higgins with his wife in the middle with his wife seated before him. Eamon de Valera is to O'Higgins's, well, on the left as you're looking, and on the right is Rory O'Connor, the best man at that wedding. Perhaps the most famous revolutionary wedding portrait of all time, Tom Barry, who is there, and there is his wife, with de Valera seated in between them. Emmett Dalton with his wife, of whom there are some Dalton papers at the Burns Library, I believe, in relation to his later career in relation to the film industry. And this is a photograph of their actual wedding. They got married, actually at the same place we got married, in the Imperial Hotel in Cork City. They got married in October 1922. The Imperial Hotel was the headquarters of the pro-treaty forces. One of the kind of main dining rooms, maybe that's the room where we had our wedding reception, I don't know, but that's where they had their actual wedding. And as it happened later in that evening, a soldier, there was a kerfuffle at the wedding, and a soldier was shot and killed during the wedding reception. Thankfully, that didn't happen during our reception. And perhaps the saddest one of all, this is a still from a newsreel, a British Pathé newsreel short film of Gearóid O'Sullivan in the middle there, and his wife Maud Kiernan. And the woman sitting on the front row on the right in black is Kitty Kiernan, and this was supposed to have been a double wedding. It should have been the wedding where the two sisters got married, but of course her fiancé, Michael Collins, was assassinated in August of 1922. But there's a glut of revolutionary marriages. After the Rising in 1917 to 18, again in the summer of 1921 into 22, and again another series of them between 1924-25 as the Civil War comes to an end, and suggesting that to a certain extent romantic life responded to the lulls in revolutionary activity. But I want to start with thinking about the letter, the love letter as an object. And after all, these are my primary sources that I will talk about today. Archives across Ireland and here too at the Burns in Boston College have preserved the correspondences of many revolutionary figures, from the well-known, such as the letters of first President of the Irish Republic, Eamon de Valera, to his wife Sinead on one of his US tours, those letters are here, to the more obscure, such as Fred Cronin, transport officer of Cork No. 2 Brigade of the IRA, to his 5 children from prison in Spike Island in Cork Harbour. And all of these letters from across these archives offer a remarkable glimpse into the most intimate of relationships, frequently at times of immense personal significance. Young couples in the raptures of early love, parents awaiting the birth of their first child, or married couples facing the possibility that one of them may die on hunger strike. They offer intense, almost voyeuristic glimpses into painfully personal moments. Terence MacSweeney told Muriel Murphy that you make earth beautiful, beautiful for me. You draw me to heaven indeed in our perfect love. Kevin O'Higgins had a whole series of pet names for Bridget Cole: Baby, Bird Child, Child Woman, My Wee Girlie, Madame Defarge, this is a nod to A Tale in Two Cities, My Wee River Sprite, or The Little Adjutant, he called her as well. Joseph Campbell wrote to his wife Nancy from his Civil War jail that he suffered, quote, absolute agonies when I think of you. I want you so much. I want you to be near me, to feel your flesh and hair and breath. I want to kiss all the little quivering, soft, intimate places of your dear, dear body. And such correspondence has generally been neglected by historians of the Revolution, apart from individual biographers of the more famous men who give a brief glimpse into family life, but are really interested in the political narratives. And so if the personal correspondence has been consulted at all, it is generally to illuminate political events. Yet this dialectic between civilian and combatant, between politician and fiancé, or between revolutionaries and their families, reveals to the extent to which these categories are emotionally fused during the revolution itself. Mary McAuliffe and others have argued that the Irish Revolution saw the home front become a battlefront as violence from all sides crossed over into the domestic space. But I suggest that the emotional front was another battlefront during the revolution, and that the bonds of love constructed, reinforced, strained, and even ruptured between 1916 and 23 were critical private mechanisms to maintain morale, to process turmoil, and to make sense of fear, grief, despair, or all of the other revolutionary emotions. So I want to point out a few features which raise important methodological questions about how historians can approach this sort of intimate correspondence. And the first thing that I want to talk about is the question of separation, right? So all of the letters that I have looked at are occasioned by separation, by the separation of one correspondent from another. Many were written from prison or internment camps, or from travel abroad, or even from smaller distances within Ireland, which seemed all the greater as revolutionary troubles disrupted train timetables and made even bicycle travel risky. For Kevin O'Higgins, his girlfriend's absence on holiday in West Cork in the summer of 1920 was, and there she is on the left, she was a teacher at Knockbeg College in Carlow, and there she is with some of the other staff of the college. And he described her absence as a period of grass widowerhood, when he was leading only a kind of semi-existence, suspended animation, like some of those beasties what hibernate. And he longed for his little son to come back to him so that he could live a full life again. Terence MacSweeney's relationship with Muriel Murphy was characterized more by separation than by togetherness. Deportation after 1916, separation while he worked around the country for Sinn Féin election campaigns, and recurrent imprisonments throughout 1917, 1918, and 1919 ahead of his final imprisonment and hunger strike and death, ultimately, in 1920. And it's very clear they spent more days apart than they spent together during their marriage. Yet being apart from her, he wrote, has even a joy of its own, for I fill my thoughts of you and picture you and pray for you in a way that is special because we are apart. Frank Gallagher, the Corkodian journalist and propagandist, wrote to his fiancée Cecilia Saunders that though we may not see each other for months on end, yet there seems to exist almost a spiritual connection, a life within a life, a joint existence. 9 months into his imprisonment, Owen MacNeill wrote to his wife that his home and family were never out of his thoughts. "My imagination keeps haunting the place like a ghost, with such intensity of feeling that it would not surprise me in the least to hear from you that my actual presence had made itself felt at times." So absence, as Liz Stanley has pointed out, is a constitutive feature of letters, perhaps all the more so during a revolution. And this was demonstrated to an extreme degree by the letters between Cathy Barry and Jim Maloney, grandparents of another recent Burns scholar, as it happens, Una Halpin. So Cathy, who was the sister of executed IRA volunteer, the famous Kevin Barry, and Jim, one of a trio of IRA brothers from County Tipperary, declared themselves to each other on the 4th of January 1923, after meeting through anti-treaty activities in the autumn. So 4th of January. 3 days later, they said goodbye to each other. And they did not meet again until July 1924. She was arrested, he was arrested, but they wrote to each other constantly throughout that period, through her brief imprisonment in Cork jail and his wealthy one in Civil War internment camps. And she struggled terribly with their separation, threatening throughout the letters, half jokingly, but regularly, to fall in love with somebody else. "I think I'll fall in love with somebody else," wondering if she hadn't imagined him after all, and recognizing the effect the separation was having on her. And there's an extract there. "Sometimes I want to go and kill somebody when I think of you there in jail. And you'd be much happier and better off if you weren't engaged to me. Why didn't you love somebody normal, Jim? Somebody who would be able to write you a nice letter every day and would have time to cook things for you and generally behave in a nicer, normal, even kind of way. And what did you want making me love you, Jim? Hadn't I troubles enough already? I used to have a great time no matter how much I had to do. There were heaps of lovely people and lovely places and lovely things, and now that's all over. Nothing is at all the same." It's kind of depressing. The letters then are also communicative. Right? They are not diaries or memoirs, but they're part of a dialogue between two people. They were intended to be read, and in most of the cases that I'm talking about today, formed part of an ongoing, lengthy correspondence which reflected deep and usually long-standing affective ties. And for most of my couples that I'm talking about, I have both sides of the correspondence, but not all, and that is also significant. That makes a difference. Bridget O'Higgins, for example, destroyed her letters to her husband after his murder in 1927. So we have his letters to her, but not her letters to him. Muriel McSweeney's letters exist, have been deposited in the archives at University College Dublin since at least the 1990s, but are not available to researchers. And there's the line through the UCD catalogue explaining that her letters are not available for consultation. And in such cases as this, where the other side of the correspondence is lost, usually the female side of the correspondence, or unavailable, this has consequences for our understanding of the emotional economies which prevailed in revolutionary Ireland. But even where women's voices are present, the correspondence still needs to be read against the grain to uncover the inner experiences of women frequently left holding the fort as the demands of revolution disrupted family life, with immense practical, financial, and emotional consequences. And the case of Nancy Campbell is a useful illustration of this. So writing to her husband, Joseph, on the 30th of August, 1922, approximately 1 month after he had been imprisoned, she told him she had just done up a parcel of clothes for him. 2 old thin pairs of shoes, some long trousers and wider ones, also a khaki shirt that I mended up. She was worried that the khaki shirt might be scratchy on his body, so she told him to wear a cotton one underneath, then the flannel one won't need as much washing. She promised to make up another parcel of papers and eatables, foodstuffs, but the only difficulty, she wrote, was to travel in with so much luggage. Because Nancy was coming from Lacandara, the Campbells' small cottage in rural Wicklow on the other side of Enniskerry, all the way by bicycle to Mountjoy Jail on the north side of Dublin City. She couldn't afford a train ticket, and so she had to cycle the 18 miles. And it's hilly, right? It's hilly in Wicklow. If she had to stop to collect foodstuffs on the way, time was even tighter, because she had to be at the gate of Mountjoy by 1 p.m. in order to hand the parcels over. So she didn't have time to stop at the chemist to fulfill Joseph's request for a gargle, some kind of throat medicine, and for shaving soap. And of course, even if she made it, having cycled 18 miles with parcels of clothing and food on her bicycle, she wouldn't get to see her husband. Visits were not allowed for any of the Civil War internees in this period. So Nancy would simply hand over the parcels to the prison authorities, turn on her heel and cycle 18 miles back to Lacandara, back to her domestic responsibilities as a mother of 3 small boys, back to the additional responsibilities of trying to keep the farm going, get the hay in, get the turf cut, see after the animals, make sure they're not breaking into neighbours' fields. Nancy's days were packed. This is the only photograph I have of Nancy. And her letters to her husband are understandably brisk, staccato, dashed off at the end of another bone-wearying day. There's an extract there of one of her letters. XXX, she marked on the page. An interval in which I twice had to hunt Grattan, the horse who kept breaking into the neighbour's field, mend fence, milk cows, feed calf, get boys to bed, have mug, read the paper, and it's now 11 o'clock and I'm cold and sleepy, but if I don't finish this tonight, I won't get it off to you. So her letter, she doesn't have the luxury of time that he does to pour out all of his emotions in the letters. She has another shift to do. Yet the very question of absence being the occasion of this series of correspondence is also worth pausing over, for it too raises questions about the limits of historical knowledge. We know very little of these couples' inner lives during periods when they were together. And so for many of the people whose lives I've been prying into, this state of absence is all I know of their relationships. And so leavening these experiences of separation, loneliness, fear, frustration, or anguish with the more mundane flower of everyday life is essential. And even between the lines of these more intense emotional expressions, we can see normal life continuing. Social events, outings to the theatre, literary salons, gossip about people they knew in common, work of varying kinds, planting crops, doing the garden. Here's a painting by the Dublin painter Estella Solomons of the Morrow family with Frank Gallagher, one of the men that I'm looking at. He is down at the bottom. And he had a very rich and lively social life in literary and artistic Dublin, even through 1920 and 1921. So these kinds of everyday activities carried on, even in the midst of revolutionary upheaval, and knowledge of this, or being attentive to that, helps to ground these letters in the quotidian as well as the exceptional. So the letters that Irish revolutionaries wrote to each other then functioned as an instrument of mutual commiseration and emotional union. Telling your loved one how lonely you were without them was in one respect a means to reassure them that they hadn't been forgotten about, that they were always in your thoughts, all the more important when your loved one had been imprisoned for revolutionary activities. It was a way of constructing an intimate, emotional community populated by two, expressing and sharing intense feelings of loneliness, misery, and despair. And in doing so, loving pairs, particularly husbands and wives and betrothed couples, adhered to the codes of romantic love that had been established through the epistolary norms of the 19th and early 20th century. And this, in part, is reflected in a shift in the letter as a communal object, from a communal object that is designed to be read aloud, to an elite model, a more elite model of private correspondence with an emphasis on intimacy and honesty. Frank Gallagher composed not great love poetry for his fiancée. I will say I have not been terribly impressed by the standard of love poetry that I've seen in these letters, and urged her to offer up her unhappiness at their separation to Christ. There is a lot of offering up the pain. Terence McSweeney, also very into offering up suffering, told his pregnant wife that deep in the innermost shrine of my heart, there is one special place for my own darling wife that is hers and no others. And some of the correspondence surprises me. So, for instance, Kevin O'Higgins' letters to Bridget are humorous, gently teasing, self-deprecating, quite some distance from the picture of the kind of flinty, dour, conservative reactionary that we get in the mainstream historiography. Yet a letter, through the handwriting, through idiosyncratic spelling, grammar or punctuation, the folded up paper placed by the letter writer's hand in the envelope, perhaps also tea stains, ink blots, little drawings, PSs, writing sideways on the page, all of these features of the letter serve to bring the absent letter writer physically closer to the recipient. The tone of the letters could also summon intimacy. For every MacNeil letter, erudite and formally constructed, even when writing intimately to his wife, there was an O'Higgins, full of abbreviations, apostrophes, run-on sentences, conversational and casually intimate. These letters were material artifacts with an intimacy produced by their physicality as objects and by the social and emotional codes which underpinned them. And the import of this can really be felt even at a distance of 100 or so years. Through the letters that I've been looking at, I've gotten to know their voices, understand their feelings, sometimes materially, by following the underlinings, the emphases, the postscripts, tracings of that their pen made on the page, and following the heights and travails of their relationships. I have worried about them, I have wept frequently, and on one occasion I even cheered when a really long-awaited and much-delayed marriage, I realized it had happened, and I cheered. And so thinking about the history of emotions during the revolution also asks the historian to recognize their own emotional responses to the material. And through that affective empathy, perhaps we arrive at another kind of historiographical insight. I want to talk briefly about a different repository of a different kind of revolutionary love, and that is the prison autograph book, some wonderful examples of which we have here at the Burns Library. And these, as Margaret Helmers has observed, these draw on long traditions, everyday or commonplace books from the early modern period, friendship albums from the late 19th century, and the craze for memorialization arising from the Great War. But while Helmers rejects the significance of friendship books, the emotional significance of these books in favor of a simply politicized narrative, I think this imposes a bit of an ahistorical binary opposition on these objects. Signing a prison autograph book was clearly on one level about defiance, about proclaiming one's revolutionary ideology, and this is evident in the nationalistic verses and doggerel which frequently featured. But it was also a means of inscribing one's friends literally on the page. Many verses spoke of friendship. Roses may fade, flowers may die, friends may forget you, but never will I. Or, dearest Nellie, remember your little nurse friend when you were on hunger strike. And good-humoured ragging about romance was also a feature. So the Crumlin Road Jail autograph book, which was a male prison, and there is something going on about gender here, has a lot of warnings, don't fall in love. When you're on the sofa sitting and your sweetheart by your side, beware of false impressions, for his moustache may be dyed. There's lots of funny ones. There's another funny one which ends with a Sligo girl having corns on her. Dublin girls are lovely, Belfast girls are sweet, but all I want is a Sligo girl with corns upon her feet. Just another one. So love is absolutely one of the most common themes evoked in these autograph books. Love for dear old Ireland, friendship, wistful verses for an absent romantic interest, or warnings about falling in love. And with their amusing intertextual jokes, pencil drawings of prison life, and roll calls of names and addresses, ultimately these understudied autograph books are material records of the love which underpins revolutionary comradeship. And this is an interesting one which I spotted on Monday. So it is Cecilia Gallagher, who was the wife of Frank Gallagher, who I've been talking about already. And what she has written on a page in an autograph book is the dates that she and her husband were married at the front. So they get married married May 24th, 1922 in Cork, and then their various dates of arrest that they were held in prison. You can see they overlapped in prison for quite some time. So you can see love throughout the pages if you were looking carefully enough. But there was a delicate balance to be struck between the normative emotional regime of romantic love and the competing emotional regime of revolutionary ideology. Alongside the way that revolutionary circles facilitated romantic partnership, that I've been talking about already, the strains that the Irish Revolution placed on intimate relationships were enormous. Imprisonment meant that families were separated for months on end. Even the demands of work, being at liberty but working for the revolution, reorganising the volunteers, electioneering, prisoner relief work, propaganda work, not to mention being on the run in an IRA column, All of this had a sizable impact on normal life. In the most extreme cases, men died for Ireland, killed in an ambush, executed, or through the prolonged agony of hunger strike, and left wives, parents, and siblings behind. Love has frequently meant suffering. Love in a time of revolution meant that suffering was often exacerbated. Yet many revolutionary correspondents framed their suffering as a noble sacrifice to make for the cause. Frank Gallagher urged Cecilia to be prepared to suffer, and you will be all the merrier when you come along to me. Jim Maloney admitted to wishing it was all over, even before he was arrested during the Civil War. He grappled with the awful feeling of wanting someone who you'd have to wait ages for. Cathy Barry's letters revealed the depths of her despair and loneliness and are actually quite difficult to read in the end. She described one letter, she said, "This letter is heartless, but dear, it's only because my heart is all used up." And she tried to suppress her emotions, writing that, "Still I have the same awful feeling that I mustn't cry or give in at all. Always that feeling since 1920, when her brother was executed. Be a good soldier. I suppose that's morale." Owen MacNeill told his wife that it was your duty, yours and mine, and God's will that we undergo this separation, and we must take it cheerfully and with confidence that all of these things are working towards good. Not everyone was stoic. Joseph Campbell, the Belfast-born writer imprisoned during the Civil War, was quite different. His extraordinary letters, completely extraordinary, are a chronicle in disillusionment, an unflinching declension from hope, through grief, through anger, despair, and dejection. "When I get out, sometime I hope this side of Christmas," he wrote in August 1923 to his wife, "you'll find me so cynical and so embittered. But I will not show this cynicism or the bitterness to you. I will keep it for the outside world. The lesson that all this has taught me is that nothing but dishonor, cunning, and smart aleckism, as distinct from real ability, succeeds in this world. People of my sort never succeed. I will live every moment of my life as I never lived it before, and I will live largely to myself. I can never have any belief in human nature again." And there's another methodological conundrum at the heart of my examination of this intimate correspondence. For all that these letters were intimate, private, dealing with intensely personal matters, many of them were subject to scrutiny by various censorship regimes, especially those going in and out of prison. Even for couples at liberty, caution was necessary, even when time could be found to write. So writing during the height of the War of Independence, Kevin O'Higgins spoke obliquely of the dance, that's the war, our friends, the British, and he created elaborate subterfuge about his travel plan. So in his letters, he said, if I send you a telegram to tell you that I'm coming by the 6 o'clock train, that means I'm not coming at all. So there's these various kind of codes and systems. Frank Gallagher acknowledged in July 21 that he had barely written to his fiancée for 6 months, such was his overwork. In hiding in rural Tipperary in the early days of the Civil War, Cathy Barry and Jim Maloney had to rely on the Republican mail system to get their letters through. This is a hand-delivered system. At best, twice daily deliveries, pretty good. An Post could take a leaf out of that book. But at its worst, letters could be held up for weeks or simply never arrive. Actually, UPS could take a leaf out of that book. For those in prison, the knowledge that the censor was reading their most intimate correspondence was dreadful. Joseph Campbell writes there, "As so many censors' eyes see these letters, I will cut out the intimacies." So he's explicit that he's not writing personal material, including personal material in those letters. There's a beautiful painting of Joseph Campbell there. Jim Maloney described it, the knowledge that censors were reading his letters, as a queer kind of restraining influence, while Cathy commented acidly that the censor must feel awful reading one's personal letters, if he's any way decent at all. And a lot of her letters, she addresses the censor obliquely. She's like, "You must feel terrible. What kind of person is he at all? If he's going to be reading these letters, he must be ashamed of himself." She knows that he's there. And Joseph Campbell observed that it is most annoying to have what one writes pawed over by a third party. For Nancy, his wife, it blighted her style to feel that the alien eyes might read it. And some correspondents didn't feel that the letters that had been seen by a censor were real letters at all. At least one engaged couple, Eileen McGrain and Patrick McCarville, did not write to each other during his imprisonment for that reason, because they knew that the letters would be read. The idea that you'll have to imagine all the left out parts was a recurrent trope from the post-Rising period through to the Civil War, and poses a particular challenge for the historian of emotion, traditionally interested in precisely written expressions. What does this mean for our understanding of revolutionary emotions when individuals ask their beloveds to imagine all the things that they felt reluctant to write? And indeed, some correspondence was inked out or stopped altogether. 2 of Cathy Barry's letters were returned for abusive language and objectionable misstatements, and this provokes a whole series of letters on her part where she thinks about what could I have written that was abusive. And many had sections blacked out. Nancy Campbell got many of her letters through with large, heavy blue crayon all over the pages. And she said, that blue pencil is the limit. It comes just at the moment I'm most interested. And when I was reading those letters, I agreed with Nancy. That was also the moment where I was most interested, and it's very frustrating. And so this question of censorship, regulations surrounding letters, and the agitation all of this provoked among the correspondents has made my own positionality as a historian, bringing another pair of alien eyes to that correspondence, all the more visible. So when the censor told Jim Maloney there on the right-hand side, do you mind asking this lady to write plainer, please, as it takes longer to go through her letters than any other correspondence? I sympathized. Her handwriting was truly difficult. It is tough going. And to be fair, she knew this herself. She observed that her writing was good for jail, for that quality it has of keeping a prisoner busy for half a day trying to make out some of the words, but it keeps historians busy as well. So while the intrusive nature of historians' work is often taken for granted, these asides have given me pause. These historical subjects, like many corresponding during the Revolution, knew their letters were being scrutinized, felt angry at having to suppress their true thoughts and feelings, or having to limit themselves to 400 words or 1 letter out a week. And a common strategy was to use code or subterfuge within regular letters. As I've already alluded to, so the code. Although this might risk the letter being held up altogether if the code evokes some suspicion on the part of the authorities. Another strategy was to send sub rosa letters or secret letters. And in almost every prison during the Revolution, there existed an elaborate system for passing secret mail in and out via a friendly prison guard, stuck underneath the front page of newspapers, hidden inside a handkerchief, rolled up in cigarettes, or even pasted underneath the lid of a pot of jam. That's one of the best tactics that I've found. And Joseph Campbell gave his wife Nancy elaborate instructions for how to indicate that she had received the sub rosa letters by marking her legitimate letters to him with a series of code marks. You see the 3 X's at the top. If she received that letter, she was supposed to write 3 X's on the top of her letter, and 4 X's, 4, 5, 5, and so on and so forth. So there is a secret sign language that these couples have in their legitimate letters that refer to their illicit letters. Free from the alien eyes of the prison censor, but then even more vulnerable to the intrusions of the historian, people like me who come along 100 years later and read them all. And these sub rosa letters are generally immediately identifiable for the frankness of their expression on both personal and political matters. Erotic imaginaries from Joseph Campbell, along with the depths of his psychological despair. Updates from Cathy Barry on the progress of the Civil War. She doesn't comment on political matters really otherwise, but in the sub rosa letters she does. And a truly astonishing account of Christmas 1923 in Newbridge internment camp, in which they had numerous turkeys, numerous hams, a goose, plum pudding, fancy cakes, figs, dates, muscatels, tangerines, oranges and apples, wine, brandy, and wonder of wonder, 3 bottles of champagne. I mean, I think that probably is slightly, maybe next year you could have that, though, a spread like that for the birds. And there's also retrospective censorship that's going on here. So in the 1950s, Molly Childers, the wife of Erskine Childers, went through her and her husband's letters and crossed out lots of passages. Were these the most intimate sections? The sections that might have embarrassed people still living? What letters did all of these correspondents or their descendants destroy or suppress ahead of their deposit in the archive? So we have to be attentive to the gaps and the things that are not present as well as the things that are present. So in concluding, I want to take a moment to think about time as a concept when we think about revolutionary love. And complex questions about time are intrinsic to letters of all sorts, as Liz Stanley, who I've already mentioned, points out. Letters do things with and to time. When a letter is read, its reader, of course, knows that time has passed and that the moment of its writing has gone. But at the same time, the present tense of the letter recurs, not only in its first reading, but subsequent ones too. And questions around time were particularly acute during the Revolution, when divergent temporalities governed lives inside and outside of prison. This was sometimes concrete. Days were shortened for women like Nancy Campbell, struggling to keep hearth and home together, whereas for her husband Joseph, days stretched barrenly, as flat as the landscape of the Curragh. The vagaries of the revolutionary postal system also meant that time functioned differently within letters themselves. I can't tell you how much energy is devoted in these letters to establishing which letters had been received, which letters had been written and were dispatched, and which letter was being corresponded to. In some cases, that is all of the letter itself. I wrote to you on this day, did you receive this one? I sent this letter, you should have had this one by now. I'm going to reply to you, and maybe you'll get it by the time you get the next one. They're always wondering about time. So an intricate intertextual dialogue around time thus also existed within, between, and across these letters. And sometimes this is eased, and sometimes this is obscured by the arrangement and the cataloguing of the letters in the archives. Sometimes you read the letters, you read, answer and reply, you read two sides of correspondence consecutively. Sometimes you read all of her letters once and then all of his letters, and you're trying and match them up. So even the arrangement of the letters do something to the historian's understanding of time. Questions of time are also relevant to the matter of absence, separation, occasioning these letters. In preserving in amber a couple's emotional state during a period of separation, these letters essentialize and eternalize what may have been a momentary state in a relationship. For many couples, these separations were just a drop in the ocean of time together that they had before and afterwards. In the midst of her loneliness, Cathy Barry declared, "When you get out, I'm never going to write you again. I hate these letters so much." But well into her old age, she and her husband used an intimate code for their love affair, for their love for each other, that they had developed in their letters in 1922, feeling Glen. Glen was where the Glen of Aherlow was where they met first, and they would say, "I'm feeling Glen," when they wanted to reconnect. So the knowledge that the historian has about the passage of time is also relevant to the reading of these types of correspondence. I knew already that Kevin O'Higgins had had an affair with Hazel Lavery, for example, and that he had been shot dead in 1927, leaving his wife Bridget to bring up two baby daughters. I knew already that Owen MacNeill and his wife had a long and happy marriage, albeit profoundly marked by the death of their son Brian during the Civil War. And I knew already that Joseph and Nancy Campbell separated shortly after his release from prison in 1924, amidst accusations of infidelity on both sides. I won't go into the details, but somehow he managed to carry on an affair, an emotional affair, while he was in internment camp with more than one woman. And of course, I knew already that Terence MacSweeney died on hunger strike, and that Muriel MacSweeney struggled dreadfully in the years after his death, and that their daughter Moira, was brought up by Terence's sisters, Mary and Anne, in Cork, away from her mother, and that mother and daughter were estranged and never spoke again for their entire lives. So just as the letters preserve a moment in time, they are also shadowed by the passage in time, rendering the emotions within them more painful, more poignant, perhaps more passing. So love then in the Irish Revolution, finally, was a material fact in people's lives, too long neglected by historians. It shaped profoundly the experience of revolution itself, fusing with patriotic love to create relationships underpinned by a joint revolutionary commitment. Romantic love was an understated but essential backdrop to much of the work carried out by many of Ireland's most active revolutionaries, providing meaning, motivation, and encouragement at times when the strain was at its most intense. The emotional support provided by all kinds of effective relationships was indispensable to maintaining ideological commitment through periods of intense violence. Love of all sorts, platonic, familial, romantic, profoundly affected experiences in prison, both psychologically and practically. Perhaps most importantly, thinking about love in its various guises can help to break down the barriers between civilians and combatants, bringing us closer to what it really felt like to live through the Irish Revolution. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, and my brain's buzzing. And I'd love to go back to the concept of time there and thinking through, because you're covering the revolutionary period, and I would imagine people fall on multiple sides of pro-treaty and not. Was there a concept of how long this war would go on, the Irish Civil War or this fight for Irish freedom, written within the letters at all?
Yeah, that's what. It varies as their mood changes. So there are moments of hope throughout where Cathy Barry thinks, if we just hold on, we're on the up, we're gonna come good in the end. But as time goes on and victory is no nearer, that then seems to trigger despair in turn. And I think for the prisoners in the internment camps in particular, because many of them, I should have said, so Jim Maloney is not released until 1924. What's his name? Joseph Campbell is not released until 1924. Frank Galler is not released until 1924. So it's not the case the Civil War ends in May 1923 and they're all released. They're kept on for another year in prison. So then it's a question of, well, how and when will they get released? What will be the occasion? And as other prisoners get released, then the prospect of a change is closer, and then that raises their hopes and dashes it again. So I will say that the prisoners seem in some respect a bit more stoic than those who are left outside. And I think there is something about, you can only raise your hopes so many times and then they get dashed and you end up emotionally exhausted, right? The kind of stress of that. So I think, during the War of Independence, they also seem to think, it's going to, there's going to be a truce soon, and they're thinking that in 1920 and in 1921. So I would say that their grasp of revolutionary dynamics is generally not that good, but of course we've got the privilege of hindsight that they don't have. But yeah, thinking about like the moment of victory, that's maybe something I'll go back and read through in the letters again, because when that day will come is clearly important in determining their emotional state. So yeah, that's useful. Thank you.
Question this side of the room. How well done, Jennifer.
Thank you, Caoimhe. That was beautiful and so insightful. I'm wondering to what extent you think the tone of many of these letters is specifically revolutionary. Emotions must have been so heightened, or whether you think this contributes to a sort of perhaps a larger project for you on Irish marriage and Irish intimate life. And I also wonder, from the point of view of a real person with a family, whether guilt and resentment factor into these letters. I think about the man who's languishing in prison and his wife who's cycling 36 miles and taking care of a farm and children, and whether it beggars belief, but whether there's anger as well that you see in this.
Yeah, that's a good question. There is, but I think the norms about what can and can't be expressed are very strong, and that is to do. There is a kind of restraining influence if you adhere to a revolutionary ideology, even if that ideology has landed you in prison or taken your husband away from you and you're left on your own. It still is very difficult to openly talk about that. So you can read it in hints and in little asides. So for example, Joseph and Nancy Campbell, she wants to bob her hair. There's a whole thing about hair in their letters. She wants to bob her hair. He forbids her to bob her hair. She does it anyway. He has fantasies about her with short hair. And I think that bobbing hair is code. It's a very obvious code for independence, right? And for like a new woman asserting her independence. And I think some of the tensions in their relationship is expressed through all those discussions around hair. She also wants to give up the farm, give up the home, and move to kind of a more manageable, smaller cottage. He forbids her from doing that as well. So big decisions, I think, or decisions around the future of the family or the future of an individual, that's where you can read some of the tensions around guilt and resentment. There are lots of letters to her that I think he didn't send in the end because they are quite extreme, and he is very angry, and he tells her that he hates her, and and she, I don't think, has received those letters, but he kept them with his papers, and they are deposited in Trinity College. So I think in extreme circumstances you can read guilt and resentment and anger, but for the most part I think that is quite heavily sublimated by the need and the desire to put a good face forward for the revolution and maintain revolutionary morale. In terms of how specifically revolutionary is the tone, I think it's saturated. In the revolution, it is written through everything. It is, everything they do is determined. Most of them are working full time for the revolution in one respect or another in their various activities, or they're imprisoned for their revolutionary activities. And so all they write about in prison is, can you send me this? I mean, I have so many lists. I mean, you could write a really interesting history of like consumption, like consumer practices in 1910s and 1920s Ireland, because we have all these lists of the kinds of things they want. They're very specific about the food they want, about the clothes they want, about the books they want. So you get those glimpses, I suppose, of everyday life through it. But the revolution, I think, saturates the correspondence in a really deep way. You probably could do a longer history of marriage that would be really interesting, but I think it would be tricky because this comes to back to this question of separation absence. So we don't have their correspondence in peacetime, right? When they're just married couples living a regular life. Nor do we generally have correspondence of non-revolutionary couples, because those are the kind of ordinary people who don't make it into the archives. So I think you can tell a history of everyday life through these letters, but it would be more difficult to tell a longer history of marriage.
Here, let's see, because we have 4 questions and we have, maybe you can do 1 or 2 out of this here. Let's see. So I think order of hands raised here. Let's see what we can do here. Okay. People maybe don't. Thank you for coming. Okay, good. Yeah, make your way. Did you have a question over here in back? Who is next? Yes? Okay. Let me give somebody who doesn't often have a chance here. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Caoimhe, for coming out and talking to us. Actually, have 2 quick questions. They're regarding separation. The first question is, do you think, first of all, you mentioned how some of these couples obviously wrote letters while they were separated and apart, and then once actually coming together finally, like that one couple who had charged infidelity on both ends, right? Kind of separated after some time of release from prison. So that kind of brings the question to my mind of, do you think that rather than separation being a factor of weakening the bond between the couple, do you think it might have been a factor that actually deepened and strengthened the bond of the couple in a way that, physical presence might not have been able to do? That'd be my first question. And then the second question is, what effects do you think, in your opinion, did offering up their separation, the longing, the sufferings to Christ, what effects do you think that had on their relationship?
Yeah, those are really interesting questions, and I think, here we are kind of in the realm of the unknowable, really, but it is possible for me to imagine that there were couples who found it easier to express themselves on the written page than they did verbally or physically, and that the state of separation might have prompted, as you said, a deeper kind of emotional connection, or facilitated a deeper emotional connection than might otherwise have been the case. I think that's a really interesting point that I'm going to take away and think about what I can do with that, and how I might begin to explore it further. Because even where we do have letters when they are together, or momentarily separated, as distinct from separated through imprisonment or through revolutionary activities, those letters tend to be more mundane. I will arrive on the 6 o'clock train, or I saw such and such yesterday. They're kind of more everyday, mundane matters. I suppose we'd have to try and figure out what kind of, we could look at the norms of emotional expression through letters and how those are, how people are taught to write letters. There's a really interesting article by a woman called Martha Hanna, who looks at French, in the American Historical Review, who looks at French soldiers' letters to their families during World War I and the letters back in return, but she traces it back to the way French school children were taught how to write letters in the early 20th century. And I would like to kind of see if something similar could be done for the Irish case. Offerings up separation to Christ. I will say it's not everyone, right? Not everyone has that. And the couples that do, I was very taken aback by how religiously saturated Terence MacSweeney's letters are to his wife. It is, I don't want to say religious mania, but I think we're not that far away from it. He clearly has a deep, deep religious sensibility. And I think you can trace that through to how he approached his own sacrifice and his death on hunger strike and his own martyrdom. So there is something about a mind that is given to those kinds of religious expressions that might be interesting also. But it's not everyone, and I want to be clear about that. But yeah, I'm going to take away the question about separation, bringing them closer, making them more intimate, and see how we might trace that through. I guess the question about Cathy and Jim Maloney referring to Glenn, I feel Glenn, you can, and doing that into old age is worth thinking about there.
We have to go.